On a January night in the 1850s, a blizzard rolled across the Texas panhandle with winds strong enough to bury a standing horse. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Snow was blowing sideways across the Llano Estacado, the staked plains, with nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles in any direction. Anyone caught on that open grassland without shelter was dead by morning. 800 feet below the surface of the plains, on the floor of Palo Duro Canyon, Comanche warriors were asleep. Not huddled, not shivering, asleep. Women and children lay under stacked buffalo robes, warmed by a low fire that hadn't gone out all night. The tipi walls weren't shaking. The wind above the canyon rim was screaming, but down on the canyon floor, the air barely moved. By morning, the warriors would eat dried pemmican, check on their horse herd grazing the canyon grass, and go about their day like the blizzard overhead was somebody else's problem. What nobody outside of Comancheria understood was that this wasn't luck, and it wasn't toughness. The Comanche had engineered an entire system for surviving the deadliest winters on the Great Plains, layered and interconnected, from the geography they chose to the grease they rubbed on their skin. And it worked so well that for over 150 years, winter was not a season the Comanche feared. It was a season they owned. How does a people go from scraping by as foot-bound hunters in the Rocky Mountains to sleeping through blizzards that killed everything else on the plains? That answer starts a long way from the southern plains and a long time before the blizzards. The Comanche were not always the Comanche. Before the 1600s, they were part of the northern Shoshone, a loose confederation of hunter-gatherer bands living in the mountains of present-day Wyoming and Montana. They scraped by in the Great Basin region, foraging, hunting small game, and living a life that most historians describe as modest at best. The Comanche language still belongs to the central Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan family, close enough to Shoshone that speakers of both can roughly understand each other even today. They had no horses, no territory worth defending, and no reputation beyond their immediate neighbors. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable. That is worth sitting with for a second, because what happened next is one of the most dramatic transformations any people have undergone in recorded history. Sometime in the late 1600s, everything changed. Through trade with the Ute, and through the fallout of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Shoshone bands that would become the Comanche got their hands on horses. Spanish colonists had kept horses tightly controlled, but the Pueblo Revolt scattered those herds, and the Ute, who lived closer to the Spanish settlements, became middlemen in the early horse trade. The bands that would become the Comanche acquired their first mounts through these Ute connections. And while other tribes adopted the horse gradually, treating it as a useful animal alongside many others, the Comanche took to it like they had been waiting for it their entire existence. Children were mounted almost as soon as they could walk, sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old. By their teenage years, young Comanche riders could fire arrows at full gallop while hanging off the side of a horse, using only a rawhide loop braided around the animal's neck. Warriors could sweep down on an enemy by riding underneath their horse, shielded from arrows and musket fire, loosing their own shots from beneath the animal's neck. No other people on the continent could do this. Not the Sioux, not the Cheyenne, not the Apache, the Spanish cavalry, trained in European riding schools, could not match Comanche riders in open terrain. It was horsemanship raised to a level that resembled something closer to art than warfare. The horse didn't just change how the Comanche traveled, it changed what they were. Within a generation, they had split from the Shoshone entirely, migrated south across the plains through present-day Nebraska and Colorado, and claimed a territory that would eventually span 240,000 square miles across parts of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado. One historian described this territory as larger than the entire European-controlled area north of the Rio Grande. They called themselves Numunu, the people. Everyone else called them the Lords of the Southern Plains, and that title was not honorary. They earned it the hard way. The Comanche drove the Apache out of territories the Apache had held for centuries. They raided deep into Mexico, sometimes riding 500 miles in a single campaign and returning with horses, goods, and captives. They dictated terms to the Spanish colonial government, forced the French to trade on Comanche conditions, and later gave the Republic of Texas and the United States Army fits that lasted decades. A man's standing in Comanche society was measured by the size of his horse herd. Some families maintained herds of hundreds, even thousands of animals. Horses were currency. They were traded for guns, ammunition, metal tools, blankets, and captives from other tribes and from Mexican settlements. The Comanche became the primary horse suppliers to the entire southern and central plains, trading mounts to northern tribes who couldn't breed their own because the winters above Comancheria were too harsh for foals to survive. By controlling the horse supply, the Comanche controlled the economy of the plains. But the Comanche weren't done yet, not even close, because controlling 250,000 square miles of open grassland meant dealing with a problem that no amount of horsemanship could outrun: winter on the southern plains. If you have never been to the Llano Estacado in January, it is hard to explain what that kind of exposure feels like. The staked plains are one of the flattest, most exposed landscapes in North America. The land sits at an elevation of around 3,000 to 5,000 feet, a high mesa of grassland that stretches from the Texas Panhandle north into Kansas and New Mexico. When a blue norther comes screaming down from Canada, there is nothing between the Arctic air mass and the Texas Panhandle except a few hundred miles of grass. No trees, no hills, no natural windbreak of any kind. Temperatures can drop from 50 degrees to below zero in a matter of hours. Blizzards sweep the open prairie with wind speeds that bury livestock and blind anyone caught without shelter. Settlers who got caught on the open plains in a sudden storm sometimes froze to death within sight of their own homesteads because the whiteout conditions made it impossible to see 10 feet in any direction. Even on the central plains just north of Comancheria, winter storms could freeze entire horse herds solid. I mean, think about that for a second. A horse herd, hundreds of animals, just frozen where they stood. That is the environment the Comanche chose to live in, and they chose it because the same geography that made winter deadly also made them untouchable for most of the year. U.S. Army campaigns in this country were a disaster during winter months. General Philip Sheridan's strategy during the Plains Wars actually relied on winter as a weapon against the tribes, because he assumed the cold would pin them down and make them vulnerable. What Sheridan didn't fully appreciate was that while his own soldiers were losing fingers and toes and morale to the freezing wind, the Comanche were comfortable. They had been comfortable in winter for over a century. And the system that kept them comfortable was not one thing. It was everything, working together. The first layer of the Comanche winter survival system was not a piece of clothing or a type of shelter. It was a decision about geography. Every fall, as the days shortened and the first cold fronts pushed across the plains, the Comanche bands broke their summer camps on the open grasslands and moved to the canyons. Palo Duro Canyon, the second largest canyon on the North American continent, stretching over 120 miles through the Texas Panhandle with walls reaching over 800 feet deep, was the primary winter destination. Blanco Canyon, farther south, served the same purpose for other bands. The logic was elegant and practical. The canyon walls blocked the northern winds that made the open plains lethal. The depth of the canyon trapped warmth during the day, and the rock faces radiated stored heat back through the night. Natural springs along the canyon floor provided reliable water even during droughts that dried up the flatlands above. Cottonwood groves along the canyon bottom gave firewood and windbreaks. And the canyon entrance could be watched, giving the Comanche early warning of any approaching threat. The Comanche set up their winter camps in long rows of tipis along the sheltered canyon floor, often near the cottonwood stands that lined the Prairie Dog Town fork of the Red River as it wound through the canyon bottom. The camps could stretch for miles. Hundreds of horses grazed the curing grass on the canyon floor, and the animals themselves benefited from the same shelter. Up on the open plains, a sudden blizzard could kill a horse herd overnight. Down in the canyon, the horses stayed alive, which meant the Comanche stayed mobile, which meant they stayed fed. Hunting parties could still pursue deer, elk, and antelope in the surrounding breaks without venturing onto the exposed plains above. The canyon selection was not random, and it was not sentimental. It was strategic. The Comanche knew which canyons caught the most morning sunlight, which had the most reliable springs, and which offered the best escape routes in case of attack. Palo Duro had all three, plus a canyon floor wide enough to accommodate multiple bands at once. The different Comanche divisions, the Quijada, the Penateca, the Noconi, and others, would gather in these canyons during winter, and the camps became temporary cities of hide and cedar and firelight. If the canyon was the first layer, the tipi was the second, and the tipi was far more sophisticated than it looks. Comanche tipis were constructed from tanned buffalo hides stretched over frames of red cedar poles, the preferred wood of the Southern Plains tribes because red cedar grew straight, light, and strong. A typical tipi used between 12 and 18 poles for the frame, lashed together at the top with sinew, and the hide cover could require as many as 28 buffalo hides sewn together with bone needles and sinew thread into a single semicircular sheet that wrapped around the frame. The real engineering, though, was on the inside. Every winter teepee had a dew cloth, an inner lining made from additional buffalo hide that hung from a cord-wrapped pole to pole at about shoulder height. This liner only extended about 5 to 6 feet up from the ground, and it was the key to the whole system. The gap between the dew cloth and the outer hide cover created a column of dead air, and dead air is one of the best insulators that exists. That gap also created a chimney effect. Cold air entered at the base of the teepee, was warmed by the central fire, rose through the gap between the liner and the outer wall, and exited through the smoke hole at the top. The smoke flaps at the apex, sometimes called ears or wings, could be adjusted with external poles to control the draft depending on wind direction. The result was a structure that could maintain a comfortable interior temperature even when the outside air was well below zero. Reports from traders and captives who spent time in Comanche teepees during winter described interiors that felt warm enough to sit comfortably without heavy clothing. One account from a frontier observer compared the effect to a well-built cabin with a good chimney, except the teepee could be packed up and moved in under an hour, and somehow it gets worse. Worse for any army that thought winter would break the Comanche, because the teepee was just the shell. What happened inside it was even more deliberate. The sleeping platform started from the ground up. Woven willow or reed mats laid a springy, insulating base. On top of those, thick layers of dried grass trapped air pockets, the oldest insulation technique known. Some families went further and compacted the sleeping floor itself, scraping and packing the subsoil into a thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Think of it as a radiant heating system built into the earth. On top of this prepared floor went the buffalo robes. And the robes were not random. Only hides taken between November and March, when the buffalo's winter coat was at its thickest, were suitable for sleeping robes. The Comanche oriented the fur toward the body to capture warmth and the leather side outward to block drafts. That simple orientation multiplied the performance of everything underneath. Families slept together under shared robes. This was not about intimacy, it was thermodynamics. Shared body heat under insulating layers, with a low fire still burning in the center of the teepee and heated rocks pulled from the fire pit radiating warmth into the sleeping area, kept the interior livable even when the temperature outside dropped to 20 or 30 below. The heated rocks were a detail that gets overlooked in most accounts, but they were critical. Stones were placed in the fire during the evening, heated until they glowed, then carefully moved to the edges of the sleeping area using forked sticks. A single heated rock the size of a melon could radiate warmth for hours. Sometimes water was poured over the rocks to release steam, which added humidity to the dry winter air and prevented the cracked skin and bleeding noses that plagued soldiers in their drafty canvas tents. The Comanche used the same principle in their sweat lodges for purification, but in the winter teepee it served a purely practical purpose. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, and it goes beyond the teepee and the canyon. Because the Comanche did not simply hunker down and wait for spring. They moved, hunted, tended horses, broke camp and set up again, sometimes in conditions that would ground a modern army. Doing that required a clothing system that worked as well on a horse in a crosswind as it did under a sleeping robe. The Comanche layering system for clothing and body protection was just as calculated. They had figured out the same principle that modern outdoor clothing companies now sell for $200 a jacket. A soft hide worn against the skin managed moisture. A thick fur layer in the middle retained warmth. An outer leather layer blocked wind. Extremities got special attention because the Comanche understood, whether through trial or through generations of observation, that heat escapes fastest at the wrists, ankles, and neck, where blood runs close to the surface. Grass was stuffed into moccasins for toe insulation. Hide mitts covered the hands. Extra wraps went around the wrists and ankles. The moccasins themselves were a small masterpiece of winter engineering. Unlike the thin-soled moccasins of woodland tribes, Comanche moccasins had soles made from the toughest part of the buffalo hide, the thick skin from the neck and shoulders. They were treated with grease to make them water-resistant. Comanche men reportedly could identify any individual's footprint in snow or mud just by studying the sole pattern, heel fringe, and toe design of the moccasin. In winter, these were lined with dried grass for added insulation and wrapped with extra leather at the ankle. And there was a golden rule that governed all of it. Warm up, but do not sweat. Because damp layers in sub-zero air are a fast path to hypothermia. The Comanche dressed and worked to regulate temperature, not to maximize it. That distinction matters enormously, and it's the kind of detail that gets lost in the retelling. Modern survival instructors teach the same principle today. The Comanche figured it out centuries before anyone put it in a manual. If you're wondering how they protected exposed skin when they had to be outside in extreme cold, so was everyone who tried to fight them in winter. The answer was animal fat. Tallow, preferably from buffalo, was applied to the face, wrists, neck, and ankles. It created a water-resistant and wind-resistant film that trapped a thin layer of warm air directly against the skin. Mixed with fine wood ash, the paste darkened and actually absorbed radiant heat from sunlight while helping prevent frostbite at pulse points. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. Except this isn't about money. It's about calories and BTUs and the difference between surviving a blizzard and dying in one. The Comanche had worked all of this out without a single textbook, without a laboratory, without any of the instruments that Western science would later use to describe the exact same thermal principles. They worked it out by paying attention, generation after generation, and passing the knowledge forward through practice and oral tradition. While all of this was happening inside the canyons and the tipis, there was another layer of winter survival happening that most accounts skip over entirely. Food. You cannot maintain body heat without fuel, and fuel for the body means calories. The Comanche prepared for winter the way a nation prepares for siege. During the fall hunts, massive quantities of buffalo meat were dried as jerky or processed into pemmican, a concentrated food made from dried meat pounded together with rendered fat, and sometimes mixed with crushed nuts and dried berries. Pemmican was one of the most calorie-dense foods in the pre-industrial world, and it could last for months without spoiling. It was the energy bar of the southern plains, except it actually worked. Dried meat and pemmican were stored in rawhide containers called parfleches, folded and sealed to keep moisture and insects out, which were stacked in the tipis and cached around the winter camp. The parfleches themselves were works of practical design, often painted with geometric patterns that identified the contents and the family they belonged to. A well-supplied Comanche band could sustain itself for the entire winter without a single successful hunt, though hunting continued through the cold months when conditions allowed. Deer and antelope were available in the canyon breaks, and hunters who knew the terrain could find game even in deep snow. For fuel, the Comanche had adapted to the treeless reality of the plains in a way that baffled outsiders. Dried buffalo dung, called chips, provided steady, reliable fuel for fires when wood ran short. On the open prairie, where cottonwood groves were scarce and timber had to be hauled from miles away, buffalo chips were sometimes the only available fuel. They burned with a low, even heat, produced surprisingly little odor once dried, and were available in such quantities across the plains that fuel was never the limiting factor. Soldiers who encountered Comanche camps were often astonished by the cleanliness of the fires and the absence of the choking wood smoke that filled their own encampments. Someone saw what this system meant. Several people did, actually. But the people who should have listened didn't. Traders who spent time in Comanche winter camps, the Comancheros from New Mexico who traveled into Comancheria to exchange manufactured goods, metal tools, and weapons for buffalo robes, horses, and hides, understood that they were dealing with people who had solved the winter problem. The Comancheros visited canyon encampments regularly, conducted business, and sometimes stayed for weeks. They saw the system working. They understood that the Comanche were not merely surviving. They were thriving in conditions that sent European-descended settlers into panic. The U.S. military understood it too, eventually, and that understanding led to one of the most calculated acts of the entire frontier era. In September of 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led the 4th United States Cavalry to the rim of Palo Duro Canyon. Below him, guided by Tonkawa scouts, he could see the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne lodges lining the canyon floor for miles. Hundreds of horses grazed the grass. The winter food supply was cached and ready. The entire survival infrastructure was laid out in front of him. Mackenzie attacked at dawn on September 28th, guided to a narrow trail down the canyon wall by his Tonkawa scouts. The warriors fought back fiercely while women and children scrambled up the canyon walls and escaped onto the plains above. A Comanche leader named Red Warbenet had spotted the soldiers descending and raised the alarm, which gave the camp just enough warning to avoid a massacre. Only 3 warriors were killed in the fighting itself. But Mackenzie's target was never the people. It was the system. His soldiers captured over 1,100 horses and mules, hundreds of lodges, and the entire winter food cache. Then Mackenzie drove the captured horses 20 miles south into Tule Canyon. He allowed his Tonkawa scouts to select a few mounts for themselves. The rest, over 1,000 animals, were driven up a long draw and shot by cavalrymen. All of them. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. But what it did was precise. Without horses, the Comanche could not hunt. Without lodges, they could not shelter. Without their stored food, they could not eat. And without any of it, they could not survive the winter on the open plains. Everything was in place. Mackenzie just didn't know what everything was building toward. Because the destruction of the Palo Duro camp didn't just end a military campaign, it ended a way of life that had taken 150 years to perfect. The system that kept Comanche families warm through blizzards that killed soldiers. The canyons, the tipis, the robes, the food stores, the horse herds. All of it was interconnected. Remove one piece, and the whole structure weakened. Remove all of it at once, and there was nothing left to fall back on. By November of 1874, bands of Comanche were straggling into the Fort Sill Reservation in present-day Oklahoma. They had no mounts, no supplies, and no way to rebuild what had been destroyed before the worst of winter set in. The last free band, led by the Quahada warrior Quanah Parker, held out until May of 1875 before surrendering. The Red River War was over. If you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. While the military campaigns played out on the surface, something larger was collapsing underneath. The buffalo herds that had sustained the Comanche for over a century were being systematically destroyed by commercial hide hunters. General Sheridan himself reportedly endorsed the slaughter as a strategy, recognizing that without the buffalo, the Plains tribes could not feed, clothe, or shelter themselves. In just 10 years following the Red River War, the buffalo was driven to the edge of extinction, and with it went the raw material for everything the Comanche had built. The robes, the tipi covers, the sinew thread, the pemmican, the moccasins, the dew cloths, all of it came from the buffalo. All of it disappeared with the buffalo. The Comanche's winter survival system was not a single invention. It was a civilization's answer to a lethal environment, built from geography, architecture, biology, chemistry, and centuries of accumulated observation. Every piece supported every other piece. The canyon sheltered the teepee. The teepee housed the fire. The fire heated the rocks. The robes trapped the heat. The food fueled the body that generated the heat. The horse made the hunt possible that provided the food and the hides. Take the horse away, and the chain breaks. Take the buffalo away, and the chain dissolves. Quanah Parker, the last Comanche war chief to surrender, would look back on the Palo Duro defeat and the years that followed as the moment the old world ended. His mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been captured as a child from a Texas settlement and raised as a Comanche. Quanah himself was the product of two worlds, and he navigated both of them with the same adaptability that had defined his people for generations. He went on to become a prominent figure on the reservation, a rancher who built a successful cattle operation, a negotiator between the Comanche Nation and the U.S. government, and an advocate for his people's rights. He was received in Washington and sat with presidents. He adapted because that is what the Comanche had always done. Adaptation was the first principle. It was the principle that took them from mountain foragers to the most dominant equestrian force on the continent. And it was the principle that kept them alive through winters that killed everyone who didn't understand the land the way they did. Today, the Comanche Nation is headquartered in Llano, Oklahoma. They are a federally recognized sovereign nation. Palo Duro Canyon is a state park now, the second largest canyon in North America, open to hikers and campers who drive in on paved roads and sleep in climate-controlled RVs. The canyon walls are the same. The wind above the rim still howls in January. But the rows of tipis along the canyon floor, the horse herds grazing the winter grass, the smoke rising from dew-cloth-lined shelters while blizzards rage overhead, those are gone. The real question isn't whether the Comanche could survive a blizzard. They proved that for 150 years, over and over, while soldiers with factory-made uniforms and government supply lines froze around them. The real question is how much knowledge disappears when a system like that gets dismantled, and whether anyone thought to ask how it worked before they tore it apart. If you want to see how the Comanche built something that nobody thought was possible and then lost it all, that video is on screen now.